Greetings. Today is December 4th, 2013. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And I'm delighted today to have some special guests with me, and most of the people who are looking at this already can identify them, Governor Jim and Mrs. Brenda Edgar. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Been looking forward to doing this one for a long time. I've had extensive conversations with both of you, especially you, Governor. So I consider this to be a little bit of icing on the cake. And we've labeled this one a partnership in the public eye, if you will. So that's what we wanted to talk about. But let's start with the beginning of the whole partnership. And Governor, if I can start with you and talking about being this young college student at Eastern Illinois University and working at Cavens and Bales.
Worked at a clothing store. It was right across from Old Main at Eastern. And it's a great place to work. You saw everybody on campus. I always said that kind of helped me when I ran for student body president 3 years later. But most importantly, that's where I met Brenda. It was the summer of 1966. She had just graduated from Anna Jonesboro High School and had enrolled in summer school. And I was standing at the window at Cavens and Bales, and here comes this very attractive lady walking by. And I remember the person working with me, we both commented on she was very attractive, and I was pretty convinced. I think at the time I was 19, and I knew she had to be older. She had to be 21, as well-groomed as she was and as good as she looked. So then a few minutes later, she came into the Cavens and Bales. It was about a week before Father's Day, and she came in to buy a Father's Day gift.
Okay, this is a men's clothing store, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And what do you remember about the first conversation?
Well, as usual, I got myself in a little trouble. I, trying to make conversation with her, asked her where she was from, and she said Anna Jonesboro. And I said, well, I've heard of Jonesboro. I've never heard of Anna. Well, if you know anything about Anna Jonesboro, Jonesboro is much smaller than Anna, and she actually lived in Anna, so she was a little taken back by that. But I guess we recovered, but that was kind of the first conversation I remember.
Mrs. Edgar, do you remember your first impression?
Well, I do. I have to confess, I probably went to Cavens and Bales to get my dad a Father's Day gift because I had learned that Jim worked there. We crossed paths going to class that summer. He was going one direction, I was going the other direction, and then I somehow learned that he worked at Cavens and Bales, so I thought I would go there and get my dad a Father's Day gift. And
oh, you knew you were going to see him.
I've never heard this story before. There's a setup,
true.
huh? Yeah.
It was a setup.
Yeah, all right.
Do you remember the first date? What did you do on
absolutely.
the first date?
Yes, I do remember. We had our first date in September, end of September. We went to see a movie.
Torn Curtain. It was an Alfred Hitchcock movie. Paul Newman and Julie Andrews were the co-stars.
See, I knew I could count on you to remember the exact movie.
All the details he can remember, right. He's
okay. Well, how long into the relationship did you figure out that he had political ambitions?
Well, actually, on our first date, he talked about his interest in politics, and we went out to get something to eat after the movie, and I didn't really pay a lot of attention to it at the time.
You didn't think, well, he wants to run for office or anything like that?
I don't think I thought that.
Well, I laid it all out. She just, one time later, many years later, when she was complaining about we were doing something political, and I said, hey, I told you our first date. And
well, Governor,
she said that first date, I thought you were a little windy, and I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what all you had to say. So, I think I gave her a fair warning. I don't know if she was listening sometimes when I was telling those things.
Well, that's a lot to take in on a first date.
Well, it was a busy
right.
first date, yeah.
Okay. Do you remember when he proposed?
Oh, my, that was later, and yes, I do, matter of fact. So.
Any stories that come out of that?
Any stories, Jim? No, nothing spectacularly.
No. And we're out at Fox Ridge.
Yes.
I remember that's a state park south of Charleston. It was early spring, and we'd had a early spring day. I mean, it was a nice day.
I have to say that was before the times when people like fly to Paris to propose or
do the big dramatic thing.
Yes, it was before all that
I
happened.
thought it was pretty dramatic. And then we had a spectacular honeymoon. We came to Springfield, Illinois for our honeymoon.
Oh my.
That was a
Got to see the
big time.
Lincoln sites, and never realized we were going to spend most of the rest of our adult life in Springfield. But that probably foreshadowed what was ahead. Foretold. Okay.
Foretold our future.
Well, it does sound very romantic to see the
Oh,
Lincoln
doesn't
sites.
it? Yeah, it was.
April of
It's a great thing, though, when I did Lincoln Day dinners later,
Oh yeah.
to say that, Lincoln was so important to me that I took Brenda there on our honeymoon to see his home.
When did you get married then?
April 21st.
Of 1967?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what was it like adjusting to married life for the two of you?
It was interesting. We were students.
You say that 45 years later.
It was interesting. Jim was involved in student government at the time. So he was active trying to get, what was that?
Well, I was student body president, and the big issue was doing away with women hours, because women
Right.
still had hours at Eastern.
So he
Men
was
didn't, but
working-
women did. And
What does that mean?
well, women had to be in by 10 o'clock on weekdays and 12 o'clock on weekends. And
With
men-
no men in the dormitories,
yeah,
I'm
Oh,
sure.
but
Absolutely not.
men or boys actually,
Guys.
didn't have any hours, and so you had women who were 22, 23-year old had to be in at 10 o'clock, where 18-year-olds fresh out of high school. Anyway, that was a big issue, and I spent a lot of time as student body president. That was a good issue to kind of get the student body kind of interested and involved, and so I spent a lot of time on that. And I'd come back to the married apartments, late at night after meetings on this, and Brenda really couldn't figure out why I really cared that much
Seems
about
so
women
important.
hours now that I was married.
But it was, an adjustment, as all marriage is an adjustment.
Well, were you already a good cook by that time?
Absolutely not a good cook, and absolutely adjustment to that too. I didn't really know how
Well,
to
I
cook.
understand. I'll put him on the spot a little bit. I understand he could be a little bit on the picky side.
Okay, Jim.
Well, I guess you could say that. One incident that happened early in our marriage when we were out at the married apartments, and you have to appreciate the married apartments was about the size of this platform we're sitting on here, the whole apartment, and it had no air conditioning, and it was quite a challenge. Well, one Sunday morning, Brenda thought she'd be nice and fix me eggs. Well, Brenda likes scrambled eggs. I only eat eggs over easy or poached. I don't like scrambled eggs. And I said, no, I wanted the yolk soft inside. So she tried about 2-3 more eggs and never could get it done. And finally we had one more egg left in the house. She took it, threw it in a skillet, stirred it up, threw it on my plate, says, you eat this or you starve. It was the last time I asked her for, I think, about 25 years to fix me an egg. But she, cooking for me would be a tough thing. My mother's a very good cook, and as Brenda would tell you, probably spoiled me. She'd fix whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, and Brenda had not learned to cook from her mother necessarily, but she was a good campaigner because that right before we got married and I ran for student body president, she did campaign in her dorm and got everybody to vote for me for student body president. So if I had to choose between the two, I think at that point at least, I was looking for a good campaigner. Now today I might, be thinking about the cook.
But for the first 25, 30 years of your marriage, I think being a campaigner would be a big plus.
And she was very good on the campaign trail from the first time I ran for student body president to the last time I ran for governor.
Well, your first endeavor once you actually got into politics, I know, was an internship, and you've told me before how important that was. But can you tell me just a little bit about that experience?
Well, again, it was important for me because it got me into Springfield. I came out of a family that was not political. I mean, if anything, my parents were Democrats. And, I was always my mother had worried she'd drop me on my head when I was a baby because she couldn't understand why I had such an interest in politics. But I really didn't have connections with the party, per se. I mean, I had, connections in student government, but that's different than partisan politics. So the internship got me to Springfield and got me involved in real partisan politics and government. It was an interesting, everybody had told me well, if you want to be in politics, you ought to go into law. Now, I had a history major, political science minor. There wasn't a whole lot I could do with that, but they said go to law school. Well, I didn't really want to be a lawyer, but I applied to law school. Same day I got accepted to U of I Law School in the afternoon, I'd also applied for the legislative internship, which I didn't think I would get because they had never taken people straight out of undergraduates before, and nobody from Eastern had ever been picked. So I got picked in the afternoon for that, and it took me about 1/10 of a second to decide I'm going to take the internship over law school. And one of the reasons was, too, the internship paid. And I don't want people to think all we worried about was money, but we didn't have any money when we got married. So we worried about it, and I thought here I could do something I wanted to do, plus they were going to pay me. Going to law school, I really wanted to go to law school or be a lawyer, and I was going to have to pay them. So the internship, short term, it was very important because we got paid. Long term, it got me connected with people in government that proved to be very important in the rest of my career. I think for Brenda, and she'll have to tell you, it was an interesting, I remember when I told her we were going to go to Springfield.
Well, now wait, let's back up, because it was an exciting day when they sent a telegram.
Yeah.
So I hurried over and found you on campus and showed him the telegram, and that was was really exciting and a happy moment.
But then
I was excited.
Yeah, you were excited, but then it dawned
So
on
you were better off with him taking the internship than law school as well?
Yes, it was the right thing for the time. It was right.
But then it dawned on her, we're going to have to move to Springfield. And I remember she said, I can't ever drive in Springfield. It's too much traffic, and because
But I learned to drive in Springfield.
You learned to drive in Springfield, but you were a little apprehensive about, we thought this is the big city coming to Springfield. I mean, she'd grown up in Metropolis and Anna, and I'd grown up in Charleston, and we could count the number of stoplights in our town on one hand. And so, we came to Springfield. This was the big city. They had 4 or 5 movie theaters. I mean, there was just all kinds of things going on.
Well, it had to be a great opportunity as well to be working with a couple of the most skilled politicians in Illinois at the time.
Well, as legislative interns, we got assigned. It's a little different than how they do it now. Now you get picked by the caucus staff. Then we were picked by the academics, and then the caucus staffs would look at who the academics had picked and then choose who would be their interns. And I got assigned to a gentleman named W. Russell Arrington, who was the Republican leader in the Senate, and he was the power in the legislature. I mean, I always say that Mike Madigan is the Arrington of today, or at least the good things about Mike Madigan is the Arrington of today. Arrington was a very progressive, conservative Republican. You may not think those two words go together, but he particularly wanted to develop staffing. He wanted to bring in young people and have them in a professional way deal with the issues before state government and work with the legislature. So it turned out to be the perfect person to get assigned to, though I was scared to death of him. I mean, he was Mayor Daley, the original Mayor Daley, always referred to him as Arrogant Arrington, because he did not suffer fools well. He was a very determined individual. Yeah, demanding. And, for somebody fresh out of college from downstate Illinois, you all of a sudden get thrusted in with him. And he used to have me write letters, and I'm a terrible speller. And I used to scare me to death when he'd read my letters, because he would find any little mistake. And but it turned out to be a great opportunity, that internship with Senator Arrington.
I know that after you worked with Arrington for a while, you moved to the House and had the experience with Robert Blair as well.
Arrington, the 2 years, it was 2 years with Arrington when he sponsored the income tax, did a lot of things. So that was very exciting. But then he suffered a stroke right after the 1970 election, and really never. He came back, but he never came back as the person he was before. He had trouble with his speech, and he had to use a cane and a wheelchair often, and so he just made cameo appearances the next 2 years. And the Speaker of the House was a gentleman named Robert Blair, and he was kind of the young up-and-comer and wanted to put the staff together. And I remember he came over to Arrington before Arrington had his stroke and said, Senator, I want to put a staff together like you have. I wonder if I'd be able to maybe hire some of your staff. And Arrington says, you don't touch my staff, you know. And but after he had the stroke, then I could go ahead and go over. And so I did that for a couple of years. And that was an interesting time in the House. And for Brenda, I guess...
Were you still under an internship at that time?
No, I was a staffer. At the end of the first year, Arrington asked me to come on his staff full-time. And that required us to move to Cook County. Now, his offices were downtown Chicago. He was from Evanston, so I had to move up there. But needless to say, Brenda was really, and I was a little nervous about moving up
Yeah,
to
that's
the
a tad
really
bit bigger than
yeah,
Springfield.
that's right,
Yeah,
to the
we
really
were
big city. Well,
Going to the city.
yeah, we lived in Park Forest, and it was the Park Forest was right on the county line between Cook and Will. So somebody said it's the closest I could be to downstate, you know, and be in Cook County.
What this required of Jim was that he walked to the bus stop, caught the bus, took the bus to the train station, took the train downtown, walked, a mile onto Arrington's office, and then reversed it coming home. So it was quite a sacrifice on his part to live that far south of the city. And
But for Brenda, I think where we
Transportation.
lived was kind of an ideal spot.
It was good.
We lived in a Park
Cool.
Forest was one of the first planned communities in America after World War II, and we lived in what they call the co-ops, these nice townhouses, plenty of room for what little we had to pay at that time. We didn't have much money to pay anyway, but there were a lot of other people in the neighborhood whose husbands were traveling, and there were wives there with small children, so it was probably the ideal place for us to live in that area. And I also have to say that 2 years almost that we lived in Park Forest, that taking the IC train downtown every day gave me a little better appreciation of life in the urban area and the importance of mass transportation, particularly when those IC trains would stop in the middle of the summer. They didn't have air conditioning. These are really old cars. They went back to the 20s. And you would stop out in the middle of nowhere with the sun beating down on you. Then I understood why they used to tell about stoppage of the CTA or the trains, why that mattered, because if you're stuck in that. But that was a good experience for me. I was downtown in the Loop every day and got to have an appreciation for another part of Illinois that neither one of us had ever been exposed to.
I know that you didn't waste too much time and decide to actually throw your hat in the ring and run for office. It was 1974, so you were still very young at the time, still a young couple at the time.
Mm-hmm.
We were. We had in 70, the end of 72, the end of 70, if my date's right, end of 70, I guess we were up in Park Forest for about a year and a half. I talked to Arrington before he had his stroke to let me come back to Springfield, because I really did not want to. We just wanted to be back in Springfield. And I wanted to be in the state capital. I thought that was better than commuting. And so we moved back to Springfield and then went to work for Blair. And we purchased our first home. I was making a good salary. I mean, I was well paid for state government at that time, particularly for someone who was 24 years old. Very well paid. And we bought our first home out in Chatham. And I think we had I wouldn't say it was a normal life, I was gone a lot, but a pretty normal life, and we had a nice home, and we had neighbors that were good friends, still good friends to today. So I think Brenda liked that life, and I came home and said, we're going to move to Charleston, my hometown, not her hometown, and I'm going to run for office. So she had to leave her friends, go back without a paycheck because I wouldn't be able to stay on the state payroll while I ran. And, she had to adjust to a new town that was my town and listen to all the Jim Edgar stories, And so for me, is what I wanted to do. For her, I think it was a very, very big sacrifice. And I'll let her give her side of it.
I'm adept at adjusting because we've had a lot of adjustments in our married life, a lot of moving, quite a lot of moving.
What's the number you used to?
Well over 20 moves.
Does that mean that you learned how not to collect too many things as you moved from one place to another?
Well, You know, I learned how not to collect things, but someone else in our family is a
Yeah,
collector of many things.
I'm the pack rat. I keep
He
everything.
is a pack rat.
Well, by this time you've got a young family as well, don't you?
Right. Well, let me think. Where are we moving
Well,
to Charleston?
you got
Our
Brad
daughter was
and your
expecting our second child when we moved back
Yeah,
to
okay.
Charleston. So she was born in Charleston.
Well, that's a
Well-
challenge, just moving while you're pregnant in the first place.
That's right. Especially when I think the movers were coming the next day and Jim was in some really
it
important
was the end of
meeting.
the legislative session.
Now, by this time in the marriage, you had to know that his real passion was politics and running for office. So what did you think about that first experience? How well did you think you learned to be on the campaign trail, let's put it that way?
I think I did pretty well the first time, although it was a primary, and that's such a different campaign than a general election campaign. So we're running in a primary from we've just returned, the other person was more established in town and had a,
Well, it was tough for her,
Yeah,
Brenda, because
it
she was
was.
pregnant. And then early in the campaign, about maybe a week after I formally announced, Elizabeth was born. She was born cesarean. So, yeah, you know, it took a while to bounce back from that. Well, I'm in a very tough race, a race that I ended up losing, and I knew it was going to be tough. And, you know, we're trying to adjust, Brenda's trying to adjust to this new environment. Plus, you know, she had Elizabeth, a small baby. Brad at that point was, I think, 5.
kindergarten.
It was tough. And of course, this was a tough campaign, and I would come home, and I'm not one who hides my emotions. You know, that had to be trying for her. And she got out and campaigned as much as she could with a newborn child and, you know, a 5-year-old, and I thought did very good. But I think of all the campaigns that I was involved in, that had to be the hardest on Brenda. And it's probably, I'm very fortunate she just didn't leave at that point and tell me you're on your own.
Well, how would you rate your own performance on the campaign trail that first time out?
Well, I think I surprised a lot of people. One of the things about politics, you know, I knew about state government. I probably knew as much about it as anybody first-time candidate for the state legislature. But that's not what gets you elected. You've got to know people. You've got to have contacts. You've got to be outgoing and be able to do a lot of the things that I'd never learned in political. You know, they don't teach you that in political science, and I really didn't do that in Springfield. The gentleman I was running against, who had never been in Springfield much, didn't know anything really about state government, but he was on the county board. He had been elected. He had a business in town. He was a member of Kiwanis, so he was very well established. His family was very well established, and you know, I'm kind of on my own, and people who maybe knew me before I left Charleston to go to Springfield might have remembered me as a high school student or a college student. I don't think they thought of me as an adult who ought to be maybe their state legislator. So I had to deal with that and try to impress them that I knew what it was all about, and they needed to zero in on that. But again, people vote more on character and on personalities than they do on issues, I think. And
Did you have a stump speech that you used?
not really. You didn't get around and do all that many speeches. You go out and meet people individually. You know, I would sometimes go to Kiwanis, Lions, or Rotary clubs like that, but then you had to be careful not to be too partisan. If they had a candidates night, then all of you would be there. You'd have maybe 2 minutes to get up and try to convince them you were the best candidate. We had a few, you know, ask the candidate questions, but nobody turned out for those.
Well, I remember you told me a story when you were in high school, I believe, maybe even junior high, about
Junior high,
Frosty.
yeah.
Not that we need to tell that now. I would encourage people to go to the interview, but you learned early on the importance of at least being ready with,
Oh
with
yeah,
some
no,
comments.
I never. That was I learned that early. The other election I lost, and you know, I learned that if you're going to go speak, be prepared. Know kind of what you're going to say. Have an outline at least. And you know, I was always nervous about it, but to be truthful, my opponent really had not done much public speaking. I mean, it wasn't like I was too worried about that, and I knew more about the issues. But as I found in that first campaign, particularly in a primary, issues aren't the big issue. It's family, it's who you know, who's been with you before, a lot of issues a lot of factors that I hadn't realized. The other most important thing I probably learned that first election, besides the fact you can lose and you never want to lose again, is that it's retail politics, and you've got to go out and meet people. And I was somewhat of an introvert, and I remember going to this first very big political gathering. You didn't go with me. I was up in Vermilion County, and it was the county chairman's home, and he invited all the people in Vermilion County, the party people, and that's the big county in the district, and then invited the prospective candidates up. Well, my opponent was there, and I'm there, and he worked through. He went around and shook hands with everybody in the room. Well, I thought that was impolite to go up and stick your hands out to strangers, so I kind of stood over in the corner and figured, well, if people wanted to meet me, they'd come over and meet me. Well, needless to say, that did not make a good impression. And I had that kind of rap through the campaign. Well, he's a little stiff, and probably had that throughout my career. But I did learn after that first campaign, you shake hands with everybody you can find to shake hands. That's what people, particularly in a primary, that's what they expect you to do. But I had to kind of learn the hard way, because I found out later, none of the party people gave me a chance. They didn't think they thought I was just going to get wiped out. And it was a very close election. There were 3 of us running for 2 spots, and the incumbent legislator from Vermilion County, the big county, I almost beat him. The other guy ran a little bit ahead of him, and then the incumbent ran a little bit ahead of me. But it was a great experience. I didn't think so at the time. Losing, that night I lost, was one of the more difficult nights in my life.
Well, that's my next question. What did you think about your future at that moment?
Well, I'm sure Brenda was relieved in some ways. I was devastated. I mean, because, I knew it was going to be a tough race, but I thought this was my only chance, because I had moved back to Charleston. There wasn't anything for me to do in Charleston if I wasn't a state legislator. I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't practice law. I don't have a PhD, so I couldn't teach at Eastern. There really wasn't, and I didn't even have a teaching certificate.
So in a nutshell, he thought his political career was over at age 27.
And what did you think about him losing that first race?
I was sorry for Jim that he lost, because I knew that he was the better candidate, not in performance as a candidate, but I knew he would be a better representative. But at the same time, it was probably the best thing that ever happened to him, because he learned some lessons in losing that you can't learn any other way. And so that was good for him.
It sounds like his prospects weren't all that great if he stays in Charleston, though.
No, I couldn't stay in Charleston. We either had to go back to Springfield or find some other field. But the one thing that fortunately I did, I had basically run against the party, the local party. And after the primary, because this has been a tough, we split the town in half, split the county in half. I carried part of the county, the other guy carried the other. But I'd brought a lot of new people in to the political process, a lot of young people. And the party leaders, they didn't want me to kind of go home, take my bat and ball and be mad at all my people, because this was 1974, and that's the Watergate year. And everybody knew it was going to be a tough year for Republicans. So they came to me and asked me, would I be the party treasurer? Now, I really didn't want to be the party treasurer, but I thought, well, maybe I ought to not take my bat and ball and go home, and I ought to help out. So the county chairman who had opposed me during the election, and I got to be very good friends during that race, and we worked on electing Republicans, including the guy that beat me. And I'll never forget, the day of the election, one of the major local papers had an article saying about me, saying, well, on election day, Jim Edgar's not going to be a candidate like he'd hoped to be, but he's out there helping the rest of the party, and the party people really appreciate the fact he's stuck in there. Well, that pretty well cemented, if I got another chance, they'd be for me. So one of the things I always tell people about politics is when you run, and even if you lose, it's not a waste, because you learn a lot, but you also, people get to know you. And, 2 years later, much to my surprise, I got a chance to run again. And the reason I didn't have any opposition was because I ran the first time. And I also didn't take my bat and ball and go home, but I stayed. And for the party people, that was far more important than the fact that I knew everything about the state legislature and about what's going on in Springfield. The fact that I'd kind of now earned it from the party's perspective That was very important. I didn't know it at the time. I worked in Springfield a little bit part-time after that election, and then at the end of that year got a job with the National Conference of State Legislature, and then we moved to Colorado.
The first of many opportunities to go to Colorado.
That's right.
And did it take you very long? I know you love Colorado, so did it take you very long to decide this was a great place to come?
It was a wonderful place to live, and we lived there for how many months? 4?
4 months, yeah.
You barely got unpacked.
Before we moved again.
Yeah, well, I took the job, and for the first 6 months, I commuted from Charleston around the country. I had to go around I think I was in 40 different states in the capitals talking to legislators because we were just setting up the organization. I had to convince them to give us money. Then we moved the headquarters formally to Denver in the 1st of July, and I went out there, and then Brenda followed about a month later. We hadn't sold our house in Charleston, and we had a new house in Colorado out in the suburbs. Beautiful, smaller home, had a view of the mountains. I mean, it was a really nice place, and I was gone all the time, but at least I was leaving more money at home than I was when I was unemployed after I lost that election. And I really didn't think I would get another shot. And one of the things I've learned that you never can predict what's going to happen in politics. Now, Brenda always, I think, thought I might get another shot. I didn't. I thought I was done. But I just happened to be, I think it was in October, I happened to be traveling through Springfield, visiting the legislature when the senator from our district announced he was retiring, and the guy that had beat me for state rep, who was about my age, I didn't think he'd ever leave that job, he announced for the Senate. And I put out a press release saying I was running for the House. And then I called Brenda and said, I'll be home in about 3 hours. Could you pick me up at the Denver airport? Oh, by the way, I just announced for the Illinois House. Long pause. And as I've said, that long pause, I think, lasted for several years. Because, she was just stunned because she was just about got unpacked, and here we were going to move again.
Well, it is, politics is a matter of timing, though, isn't it?
Oh, well, yeah. Again, I think it was meant to be. I just happened to be in Springfield that day when that all occurred, and, I was able to get the press release out, and it was probably good. I then went back to Colorado because some of the party leaders tried to move this guy back to the House, not run for the Senate, and they wanted me to get out, but as long as the two of us weren't in the room together, we could always say, well, the other guy hasn't changed, so we're not going to change, and we were able to kind of work past filing date. And but no, that, if I hadn't, I think, come back and run, I really doubt if I would have ever been back and been in politics.
Well, I want to move forward and talk about after you've won the election and you've gone to the legislature, a couple questions. First of all, did you have a residence in Charleston or in Springfield or both during that time?
No, just in Charleston at that time.
It's very uncommon for wives to come, particularly when they have children. Now, some of the older couples, if the children are gone, the wife might come and spend some time in Springfield. But with 2 small children, I mean, Brenda had her hands full. Now, we did have a place in Springfield. She just never recognized it. We had a mobile home that left a lot to be desired.
Not your favorite place to live.
No, it wasn't.
The one time
That was
I got
Jim's home.
The one time I got her over there, it was for Jim Thompson's inauguration. It was right before I was sworn in, and it turned real cold. I mean, they had to call off the parade and everything and have it in. Back then, they used to have it outside. And anyway, I remember we went to the trailer. The pipes had frozen, and the next morning she saw a mouse, and so she never came back.
It was freezing in there, just freezing.
So she never
Apparently
came back.
the mouse was doing fine,
Yeah.
though.
He was happy, but I wasn't.
Well, what did you think about being a legislator? Was it all that you expected it to
Well,
be?
I mean, after being the chief aide to the speaker and the chief, to the Senate president, it was kind of a come down to be a backbencher in the minority. I mean, in many ways. Now, I liked being a person having a job where I made the final call. I didn't have to convince somebody else. But I had a lot more influence when I was Bob Blair's aide or working for Senator Arrington. I mean, I had a lot more input on public policy than I did as a freshman legislator. Though I had bills that's passed and I was involved in some major things, but still it was not quite as what I thought it would be. The other problem was I took a pay cut. I mean, legislators didn't get paid very much back then, and we'd taken a pretty good pay cut, and we still had a debt left over from. No, we paid the debt off before I ran. Yeah.
College debt?
No, campaign debt for the first
Oh.
election. That was another problem after the first election, because when you have a debt and you win, it's just a cash flow problem. But when you have a debt after a campaign and you lose, it's a debt. And one thing Brenda did make me promise that I would never get us in debt again over a campaign. If I was going to run, make sure I raised the money and didn't put us in. But we didn't have any savings, so I think that was a challenge because money was always a problem because we lived from paycheck to paycheck. When Governor Quinn vetoed the legislative pay raise a few months ago, I mean, I can't imagine how some poor freshman rank and file legislator would be able to live, because we lived from paycheck to paycheck, and it was a challenge. Brenda had to, really watch the pennies, and I was gone most of the time, and fortunately we had a per diem over here, so I could come over here and eat pretty well. But I tried to save some of that, so when I got home we could eat too.
Well, this reminds me of some of the changes that Arrington himself helped introduce to the legislative process in the state, and that kind of was the change from being the citizen legislator who always had some kind of other job back in the home district, another source of income, who would just pick up a small stipend from his legislative job, to being more of the professional legislator.
They did, and still many of the legislators still had jobs back, but I didn't.
Well, it's easier if you're a lawyer to have that kind of an
Or
experience.
you had a business set up, and maybe somebody could run it. Or now Brenda, while she always thought it'd be interesting to have a Merle Norman cosmetic studio, and one came available in Charleston right when I got elected state rep, and this is a small cosmetic sells cosmetics, and so she thought that might, and we both thought, well, that'd be good. That'd be something she could do, and a part-time job, make some money. Well, we got another education on being in
Small
retailing.
business is not, you don't make your fortune in small business.
Yeah, we didn't ever make any money, and it turned out it was a full-time job for her. So she also tried to deal with that while I was a legislator, trying to make ends meet. And it was, financially it was a challenge. The district, too. The other thing, it was really much more relaxing for me in Springfield than when I was home, because I always had to be out. And my district was 125 miles long and 70 miles wide. And, every night it seemed like I had to be someplace. And it seemed every night, if I was at home, right when I took that first bite at supper, the phone would ring. Somebody would want something. So it was quite a challenge, I think, in many ways. And but I still enjoyed being my own man. But I think from Brenda's perspective, it probably wasn't the best setup that we could have had.
Well, I want to move forward to the next big event, and that's, I think it's April of 1979, the first time Governor Thompson is going to come knocking at the door.
It was in either late January, early February. The legislature had gone back into session, but we weren't doing anything the first month. And he called me one night, and I was gone. I was out at some function. And I got home, and Brenda said, the governor called. Well, I was mad at him. We'd got into a disagreement over the legislative pay raise, which is a whole long, involved story that, anyway, made being a state legislator pretty unpleasant, because I was one of the few who'd voted for it. And then he'd kind of gone back on his commitment, and he wanted to roll it back. And we got into, many in the legislature and the governor got into a pretty big fight, and I was very upset with him. And so I didn't want to call him back. I figured he was just calling me because he wanted to make peace, and I just didn't want to do that. I remember Brenda said, he's the governor, you're calling him back. So I called him back. And he offered me a job, which just was a shock to me. He wanted me to become his legislative aide. The person who had done it, who I'd worked with in Bob Blair's office, wanted to go do something else. And apparently they'd made several recommendations to him, and he didn't like them. And he said he wanted somebody who'd been a legislator, so he got the list of Republican legislators and settled on my name. And so he made a very attractive offer. Among other things, he figured I wanted to run for statewide office, and so he would get me a place on the ticket down the road if I would do this for a couple of years, and get him a spot in the cabinet then. And anyway, and I said, well, Governor, I really appreciate the offer, and it's very kind of you, but I don't want to do it. I like being a legislator. He said, well, now don't say no, just think about it next time you're in Springfield. Well, I hung up, and I turned to Brenda and told her what he'd said. She says, take the job.
Okay. Now, he's already kind of given us a window into your thoughts at the time. Why were you so adamant about taking the job?
I was ready to be done with this political side of his life. He'd been elected and he'd been a representative, and
plus we had the pay raise issue, and you were afraid of
yes, there was a lot of things happening because it does affect the family as well as what the legislature, how they vote on issues. And I was ready just to get out of that district and return to Springfield.
Okay.
So I was excited.
That by that time you certainly knew plenty of people in the Charleston area. But
I knew a lot of people, and I had great friends there. It wasn't that. It was more just the
legislative pay raise. Since I was one of the few that voted for it, it just blew up downstate. And people, nasty articles in the paper, people would say things to you. And Brenda was afraid to go out of the house. Almost. And
I was a little sensitive to people's comments, so I was ready to leave that environment.
And I think, and she also, the idea of going back to Springfield, because she enjoyed Springfield.
Well, we don't need to get into it now, but I would encourage people to look into the whole idea of the legislative pay raise that ended up in the cutback amendment and dramatically changed Illinois history thereafter.
And brought us Pat Quinn.
Yeah, brought us Pat Quinn. That's where he entered into the fray. But I don't want to get too deeply into that one here.
But Brenda really thought I ought to do it. She thought for a lot of reasons. And I didn't want to do it. And so I called some of my friends who had helped me get elected, and I knew they would reinforce that I ought to stay where I was. Every one of them said, take the job. Being a state legislator is a dead end, they thought.
Well, and if you've got a statewide aspiration, you're networking with everybody.
Yeah, though most of them didn't know really if Governor Thompson would really do that. Get me on the ticket, get on my ticket, get him. Yeah, something could happen. But they thought if I went and worked, because the possibility after 2 years of being legislative liaison, then going into the cabinet, they thought that was a great springboard to some good job. And so they thought that made a lot of sense. And so I began to, what I don't often do is change my mind. Because I realized that maybe I'd looked at this wrong, and so we talked about it. And then I still hadn't got back to the governor, and I'm over in Springfield for a session, and I get this call from him. He says, are you in town? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you haven't come by to see me. And I said, eh. He said, I'm sending my car to come and get you. Come over to the mansion. So I had quickly written down a list of things I wanted. I figured he wanted me, so I had a little leverage with the governor. And I had my salary set I wanted and how much to get, all this and that. And so I go over, and Thompson, there's nobody better at sweet talking you than Jim Thompson. He could, and we were in the library, which turned out to be, when I was governor, one of my favorite rooms. He had the fire going. It was a cold February day. And
it's all very calculated.
Oh, he was a pro at it. And it wasn't just me. He had worked on many times. But so we get in there, and he goes through his. Well, I think I think you're like me. He said I think you're. I've always thought you would like to be governor someday. And I looked at him. I said, no, I'm like you. I want to be president someday. I was just trying to keep him off balance a little bit. And but we had a talk, and he said he really wanted me to come. And he said, they told me other people I didn't want them, and I knew from talking to the staff that he really wanted me to do this. And I think it was because I had stood up to him. I think he told me later, he said, I knew that if you would tell me the truth, and I knew you'd tell me what you thought I needed to hear. And that was kind of the relationships we had, which was very, very rewarding. I'd worked for other people, and I was a little apprehensive about it, but he was probably as good a person I'd ever worked with. Now, Senator Arrington was a great person, but I was always scared of him. Governor Thompson, though, was somebody I learned to, I could tell him what I thought, and he'd listen. And often he would follow my advice. Sometimes he wouldn't. but never got mad. Never, least paranoid person I ever met in politics. So anyway, we were sitting over that day, and I have my list, and I go through it, and he said, I don't think I've ever had somebody come in for a job. I said, well, you want me, remember? I said, and he agreed to everything. He said, now you got to go talk to my chief of staff, Jim Fletcher. He'll work it out. But we agreed, and then I called Brenda. And I said, well, we've worked it out. We're going to do this. Well, I think the next week, Brenda, she drove over with me to go find a house. She wanted to move.
Time to move again.
Where did you look this time?
Well, I had a good friend who was a realtor in Springfield, and she knew what our needs were, and so our main concern was we wanted our kids to be in a smaller school district. So we looked in the Chatham School District, but happened that we were in the Springfield city limits, and so we found the perfect place for our family to go to school and grow up.
What was the neighborhood?
It's called Hyde Park.
So it's a little bit west of the lake area then.
It's off of
Yes,
Toronto
yeah.
Road.
Just it's a little west of the university. The campus is out there, and it was a small, had a tennis court, which was unheard with lights, and I love to play tennis. And this was not a upscale subdivision; it was middle class. But I remember we went out there, and I don't even know if we looked at other
Two
houses.
places, I
Okay,
think.
but when we walked into the house, we walked in the door, and this house was going to cost a little more than the other house. But I'd got a pretty good salary from Thompson, so I thought I could afford it. But I remember walking in the door with Brenda, and I said, in my mind, this is the house she's going to say. And, in about 2 seconds, we knew that's the house we wanted. And it turned out to be a great place to live. We lived there for 12 years, and our kids really grew up there. And
Was Elizabeth already of school age at that time?
She was in first grade, and Brad was in sixth grade at that time. So they had it was a great neighborhood to grow up in, and great schools.
And like you say, that's the house that they remember as young kids.
Oh yes, right.
that was probably, I always try to think, did we have a normal time? Because I was always out running and doing. In many ways, that was probably about as normal. Look, there's a year maybe in Charleston I thought was kind of normal, but this was probably by far the most normal. We were there for 12 years. We had neighbors that were friends that we did things together. We still do things with, and every night when I worked for the governor, then later when I became Secretary of State, often I'd get home late at night, and there was a guy in the neighborhood who'd always come and play tennis with me at 11 o'clock at night. I think the neighbors probably didn't care for that, but we had the lights on and we'd play, and it was just an ideal place to be.
Well, I know one of the neighbors was Sherry Struck,
Right.
and she and her husband, but she became your secretary, your personal assistant once you became governor?
I call it secretary. I don't think we call them those anymore, but
Yeah.
she was my right hand. And really, it was Brenda and her got to be good friends. I knew Earl. First week we moved in, they had a potluck there, the association in the neighborhood, and they had just moved in. And I knew Earl from the legislature. He was lobbying, and so we spoke. Well, Brenda and Sherry, that's the first time they met. Well, they became very close friends. And so, 12 or 8 years, 10 years later, when I'm running for governor, I remember I told Sherry, I said, Sherry, I think it's time for you to move from the coal association over to run the governor's campaign office. And then,
Well, let's take one step back, though,
Yeah.
but I wanted to move on to the next time Governor Thompson has a fateful conversation with you because of another series of events that you had no control over. But again, it's all about timing.
well, Governor Thompson had indicated he wanted to find a place on the ticket, and you never know if that's what's going to happen. Well, lo and behold, about a month after I went to work for him, Adlai Stevenson announced he wasn't going to run for re-election to the U.S. Senate. And Alan Dixon, who was the Secretary of State, announced he was going to run for that, which meant if he won, that would create a vacancy. Now, nobody knew who Governor Thompson would pick if there was a vacancy, but that created a vacancy. And a year and a half later, Alan Dixon wins the Senate seat, and that office is open. And Governor Thompson had me down and said, would you be interested? I said, oh, yeah, I'd be interested. Well, we'd also begun to have discussions about me possibly running for lieutenant governor the next time around. And he said, well, do you rather be lieutenant governor? Do you rather be Secretary of State? And I said, well, you don't have the lieutenant governor to offer right now, and a bird in the hand's worth two in the bush. And so, but he didn't know if he just said, well, I said, but you don't owe it to me or you don't owe it to anybody, just, whoever you think makes the most sense. So I didn't hear anything for 2 or 3 weeks. There was a lot of speculation in the paper and, about what was going to happen. And
Plenty of other people wanted
oh
that
yeah,
job.
yeah, oh yeah.
Oh, they did. And I remember Jim coming home saying, I don't think I'm going to get that. And I said, well, why do you think that? And he said, well, I would have heard by now. I'm sure I would have heard by now.
Well, that was on a Friday night, and we knew he was going to have to. This had dragged out for a long time, and he had to make a choice. And George Ryan was interested. He was the name being mentioned. There were some women being mentioned. There hadn't been any women in state office up to that point. So and some congressmen that wanted it had come back and talked to him. So I figured I hadn't heard anything, and I thought the word around the office was he's going to make a decision soon. And so I remember going home Friday night, and Brenda wanted me to stop by and get some milk. And I remember getting a gallon of milk, put it on top of my car while I unlocked the car. I was so upset. I forgot the milk was still on top of the car, and I drove away to go home and had to go back and get another gallon of milk. But got home that night, and we still watch Washington Week in Review. It's one of the few programs over the years we watch on Friday night at 7 o'clock on PBS. And remember, I was sitting there watching it, and the phone rang. And Brenda answered, and she looked at me, and I don't think she said it out loud. She just said, "Governor." And I figured, well, he's calling to tell me, sorry, I'm going to pick somebody else, but we'll talk about the lieutenant governor, something like that. So I get on the phone. He said, you still want to be Secretary of State? And I said, yes. He says, it's yours. And I remember I hung up. I looked at Brenda. I said, I'm going to be Secretary of State, and we got to get an unlisted phone number.
Now, why did you say that, Governor?
Well, I knew Secretary of State next to the governor has got all the jobs. And you
Patronage.
Yeah. You're gonna be, and what happened, we did get rid of our number, and the telephone company gave it to some poor person who just moved into Springfield.
Oh, God.
And he just got inundated, and finally he got rid of it. But that was on a Friday night, and I was to come up on Monday to talk it over with him. Then we were going to announce it Tuesday in Springfield. And he was going to meet with George Ryan and tell him that it was going to be me on Saturday. And he wasn't really looking forward to that meeting, but he called me Sunday night. I said, well, I had the meeting, everything's set. Are you coming up tomorrow? Yeah. And I said, I'll be up. So I get up and we talk about, how we're going to handle it and everything. And then on Tuesday, this Tuesday before Thanksgiving, we have the announcement in the Blue Room at the state capitol. And life changed for me probably as much as any time in my life, and just continued to change. Probably not as much for Brenda, but then I was sworn in. I was the only new state office holder that following January. I think January 5th was when Alan Dixon was sworn in the U.S. Senate, so I got sworn in as Secretary of State. But for me, that was quite a change because now I was in one of the most visible offices next to the governor, probably the most visible office in state government. I was, if I handled it right, I would have a good shot at governorship. But at that time, most people didn't think I'd make it out of a primary because I was this unknown kid. I was 34 years old.
So you were going to have to turn right around and actually run for this
I was going to have to campaign, start right away. And, this was in January, and the primary wouldn't be till the following year, but I knew I had to get a quick start, so I'd discourage anybody wanting to run against me in the primary. And also I knew how you started. First impressions were huge in how people are going to perceive you. So I had to kind of win over all the party people. Now, one of the raps on me, I remember somebody came to talk to me and says, I think Thompson would like to name you Secretary of State, but he's worried you're not political enough. The party people want somebody that's political, particularly in that office. And I always thought I was pretty political. But I also, I wanted to do things in government.
Political versus what? Somebody who's focused on policy?
Policy, yeah. And I thought I knew both. But I was always kind of the political guy working on the legislative staffs. But one of the problems we had right off was that Alan Dixon had got a merit code passed and coded in all his Democratic employees. And that had just happened. And so you had 3,500 of the best Democrats in the state of Illinois working in the Secretary of State's office. Well, all the Republican county chairmen wanted me to go in there and get rid of them and hire their guys. And I had a meeting with them, and I told them up front, I think it was even before I swore in, I said, guys, I'm not going to break the law. As long as they do their job, I'm not going to fire them. Now, if they don't do their job, that's another thing. Oh, they were mad at me. They said, well, the Democrats would do that. And I said, I'm not going to break the law. Just, and now if there's back then, if there was an opening, you could hire a Republican. I mean, it wasn't as the laws aren't as strict as they are today. But I said, if I get a vacancy and you give me somebody qualified, I'll hire him. But I'm not going to go fire a Democrat just because he's a Democrat and have to spend all my time in court fighting over it. And so they weren't. So I knew I had that problem. So I had to kind of still win them over. And in January, February, and March, Republicans have Lincoln Day dinners. Lincoln's birthday is February 12th, but we celebrate it for months. And I knew this is their main, and I knew this from my days as a state rep. This is when they raise most of their money. And this is very important. So if they get a speaker that's good or somebody can draw, this is important to them. Well, we had a new Attorney General, new Secretary of State, and they asked me, they asked him. They really wanted me more because I had jobs. So, that's, and the Attorney General didn't mean that much to him, but Secretary of State did because we had offices throughout the state too. And so I think I did about 45 Lincoln Day dinners. So right off the bat, I'm gone every night.
Every night.
And Brenda's home. It's kind of like being a legislator again, except we had a lot nicer home and pay was a little better.
Well, Brenda, what did the kids think about their dad being the Secretary of State? Did it even register with them what that position was or who he was, that he was important?
Yeah, it did register with, especially Brad in junior high. And when Jim would go to basketball games, he had security with him. So that was kind of a buzz for adolescents to think that, there'd be a security person with your dad. Elizabeth was younger, so she knew, but both of them had their friends prior to Jim's becoming Secretary of State, so they weren't really treated different. They didn't move into town as the son and daughter of the Secretary of State. They came to town just as Brad and Elizabeth, and so that was a really helpful thing for both of them. But at the same time, their friends knew that there was something different, and so the kids did too.
Did they think it was kind of a cool thing?
I thought it was cool, but I also would constantly be, you have to be good because you can't get in trouble.
The other thing too, we're in the Chatham School District. That's a suburb of Springfield. I mean, it's a very political community. A lot of the kids they went to school with, parents worked in the government, were involved in politics. So I think it was more of a factor, the fact I was Secretary of State, because they were going to Chatham than if I'd have been back in Charleston in some ways. Particularly when I ran for governor, it got to be a real issue, I think, with Elizabeth. But I thought they handled it well. They got to do some things they didn't get to do. They get to go to Chicago. Now, they right away realized sometimes they got stuck doing some political things. It's not all fun, but they did get to go.
Like being in parades and things like that.
But they did get to go do some things and travel and they wouldn't have done otherwise. And they got the troopers. I mean, the troopers are like big brothers to them because some of them we had all the time. We had them for 12, 14 years, and so the kids grew up around those troopers, and the troopers were always very good to them. I mean, they would, I remember one time we went down to Florida. We didn't often take them out of state, but one time we did, and I remember one of the troopers took Brad fishing. And he'd go to all the football. He'd always be on the detail the night I had football games. He watched all of Brad's football games. So, it was like family, and so the kids I think kind of appreciated that. I think for the most part there was more pluses than minuses, except a few years later when Brad got to be 16.
I was going to say that was kind of a
touch
and go. When you're 16 and you're getting ready to get your driver's license.
Oh yes, and Dad controls
yes,
driver's
that's right.
licenses.
Yes,
I tried to get him to flunk him, and they wouldn't. But I also told him, I said, and he knew, and his mother reminded him, you've got your driver's license, but you're the son of the Secretary of State. Be extremely careful, because if you get stopped, it's going to be in the paper.
I remember your comment about me, and the advantage of being Secretary of State in the state of Illinois, even the kids know who the Secretary of State is.
They do. Right.
Well, the first time, when I ran the first time in 1982, of course we didn't know what was going to happen, but they started having mock elections around, and back then they would release the results before the election. They don't do that anymore.
I mean in the schools.
The schools, yeah. And they came back and said, "You're winning all the high schools." I said, "Well, of course I'm winning all the high schools. I'm the incumbent Secretary of State. They don't care who the governor is, but they sure know who the Secretary of State is, you know. And of course I'm going to win those things." But yeah, I thought the kids handled it well, and I mean, and they were definitely an asset. They never were a liability.
Yeah, they were great assets, and they were good, and I do
None
think
of
they
the
felt
kids
the
ever
pressure.
got a
I know
stop.
what you're going to say.
Never
I
got a
know.
traffic violation
I
when I
know.
was Secretary of State.
Just me.
Just my spouse here
But
did.
let's explain why I was stopped.
One night,
Well, aren't you going to explain, or are you going to
Well,
let him do
I
it?
will explain to you that I see these two red lights shining in my rearview mirror, and I think they can't be wanting to stop me because I haven't done anything wrong. I wasn't speeding, but actually did pull me over, and he came to the window and he said, "Ma'am, you're driving with an expired license plate." Well, I said, "Oh," because I didn't know that my license plate was expired. But being the wife of the Secretary of State, the first thing, he took my driver's license and kept it. You know, I guess that's what happens when you get stopped and you get a ticket. So I called Jim as soon as I could get to a phone. He was traveling, of course, away from town. And I said, "Oh, I just got stopped by the police and they took my driver's license and it might be in the newspaper." And he said to me, "Well, you know, we'll pay the ticket and you'll get your driver's license back, and yeah, it probably will be in the paper," and it was.
she was a little more emotional than she is telling the story now when she called
I
me on the
was a
phone.
little hysterical.
And I said, it'll be in the paper. Sure enough, front page of the Chicago Sun-Times the next day.
But a good politician can actually
Well-
spin this to your advantage.
Well, I
would
think everybody could relate to it, and we paid our fine. I mean, we didn't try to fix the ticket, and but it was ironic. As much as she preached to those kids to be careful, particularly Brad, who had his driver's license at that point. Elizabeth didn't have hers yet, and just preached to them about being careful. That I guess Elizabeth did get hers. I was Secretary of State when she got it too. Yeah,
I don't think so,
yeah,
Jim.
because she was a senior when I got elected governor, so she got it her junior year.
Okay.
Yeah, now she did have a little accident, but it would be Brenda that would get it. So I always
That
have
was
to
me.
remind her of that. But I think as far as the family life, family kind of stayed pretty normal.
Oh, we did. We kind of hung into a very
The wife-
low-key
And it sounds
lifestyle.
like you were working to maintain that.
Oh, yes, we did. But we were in an environment where we could do that pretty easily.
But now there were times that they would, they go out and do the campaign. I mean, one of the horror stories for Brenda is my first election for Secretary of State. I was up in the Chicago area doing a lot of 4th of July parades. You can do a lot up there, a lot of people. That's how you get to people. She went over to Champaign to do one, and it was a real hot day. And if you're the Secretary of State, you get put in the front of the parade. If you're just the wife of a candidate, you're in the back of the parade. So she was stuck in the back of this parade over in Champaign. It was 110 degrees. And just a couple weeks before, I had to arrest a group of women from Champaign-Urbana that were known as the Chain Gang. They were pro-ERA, and they chained themselves to the Senate chambers to make them do something, and it clogged up everything. And so we'd moved them out to
I
another.
just interviewed one of those
Did you?
ladies.
Yeah. And we just moved them out.
Just remember us.
Yeah, we moved them out, and then they came back in and threw blood all over the chambers. Well, that was it. We had them arrested and thrown in jail, and it was it was the last year of ERA, and it was all happening right in Illinois, and I had it, and as Secretary of State, you're in charge of the Capitol building, so I had to deal with that issue. So Brenda's over in Champaign, and well, there's the Chain Gang and their supporters just harassing her with a lot of verbal comments in that parade, and so she goes through that. Then we had an old Maverick, no air conditioning, and she was going to drive from Charleston down to Charleston.
No, Champaign to Charleston.
Champaign to Charleston on what we call the U of I Trail. It's 120, it's a highway, but there's not much there. And it broke down.
No, the transmission went out.
Of the car.
So it was a long 4th of July
there was
day
nights
for us.
before
The
cell
kids were
phones.
with me.
That was before cell
What
phones.
did you
Yeah.
think while you're in the parade, having all these? I assume these women are haranguing you.
Well, they comments something like, your husband's puts women in jail, and they just kept saying it. And finally I turned and said, well, that's what happens when you break the law. And we went on, but it was not a pleasant day for any of us. And then we get in the car, and it's still hot, and the car doesn't
It
breaks down, and he has, of course, security with him. And
she's got to walk
everybody's
she's
cheering.
got to walk half a mile to a farmhouse.
Farmhouse,
Call
I
my
know.
mother. She drives up and gets her, takes her down to Charleston. I'm up in the suburbs having a wonderful time. People cheering and all this and that. I call her that night. I'm all pumped up about it. I said, I had a great day. How was yours? Well, then she just unloads on me about how her day was. So
Not good.
yeah. So parades were not the favorite thing. Brad also was in that parade. He was carrying the banner, and he didn't like parades either after that.
Well,
None
there's
of us
another
do.
incident. I don't know if it's the same campaign, but I believe an incident maybe involving a plane ride to Moline with Ken Zender, perhaps?
Yeah.
Was that
Was it
both of
That's
you,
the
or
one that
just?
crashed. That's a crash
the
landing.
first one?
Yeah. Ken was on the
Yes.
plane that day. Yeah. That was early on when I was governor. We were going up to Moline to do an event, and Brenda and I and Ken Zender, who's on my staff, and
Yeah,
I'll
I
let
don't
Brenda-
really
I'll let
like
Brenda
to. I
describe
don't
it.
like to fly, and especially in small planes at that time. And so we took off, and the pilot said, "We're going to return to the Springfield airport. We're just going to touch down because the landing gear hadn't retracted." And so we just having a conversation. When we touched down, the landing gear collapsed, and we were skidding along the runway, and we could smell smoke, and the fire trucks were coming, and
they just told us,
It
hurry
was-
up and get out. We
yes,
got out.
and we got right out of that plane, and then
We
it
go
was
home.
even harder then for me to.
We
to
went
fly.
home. We went home, and
We didn't go to Moline.
I'd had water in the basement, and I was really worried about what am I going to do about the water in the basement. It amazed me when I went home. I didn't worry a bit about that water. I was just glad to be home. And
Alive.
the kids were there, and we're just staring at the kids. And they said, "Why are you staring at us?" And we said, "We're just glad to see you." And then that night on the evening news, they had kind of taken us out real quick, and we didn't actually see when the fire trucks got there, but it showed in the evening news the plane all mangled up, the propellers, bent up, and it's over on its side, and the fire trucks are hosing down this plane, and there's, I don't know if there's smoke or foam coming,
smoke.
but anyway, Brenda just lost it watching it. It was kind of, I think, a after effect, and it was a few weeks, maybe a few months
It
before
was-
she got on the plane again.
Well, I want to go. Just a couple quick questions on your time as Secretary of State, and keep it very general. But I wanted to see if you thought being an executive, being the Secretary of State, was a better fit for you than being a legislator.
Oh, I enjoyed it a lot more. You get something done. I mean, I had to watch it when I became Secretary of State. I'd say something and go do it. Say something, I don't like that door. They'd go replace it. I mean, and I had to realize, I had a lot of Democrats who were worried about their jobs, so they were especially wanting to please me. Then I had my people. But in the executive position like that, you can make a decision, have it implemented, and it's done. In the legislature, you have an idea, you try to get a bill passed, then somebody else is going to implement it. And the implementation, as we've learned, watching what's happened with health care, that's 80% of the game. And so as Secretary of State, I could get things done. And while I wasn't dealing in the big issues, traffic safety, we dealt with drunk driving. I mean, we changed the whole perception in Illinois. We went from being the weakest state to one of the strongest in the country on fighting drunk driving. We initiated a literacy program that had very positive impact. So there were things you could do as Secretary of State that I never could get done as a legislator.
I want to go to a picture, my favorite picture of the two of you, and I think this is a picture from Colorado, and take the story back to Colorado because I think perhaps that's the next important call that you might have gotten.
The third call from Jim Thompson.
Exactly.
This is July of 1989. We're on our way we're driving down to St. Louis, catch a plane to Vail, Colorado, for the Secretary of State's annual meeting, which I was chairman of. And I get a page, my trooper says, call your secretary. So I call my secretary, she says, call the governor. Call the governor, the governor says, it's yours. I said, what? He says, I'm announcing I'm not running this afternoon, in about an hour. I said, okay. So I go, Brenda and I get on the plane, and, we know life's never going to be the same again. And so we fly out to Colorado, and all the way out, I'm thinking, before I got on the plane, I called my press secretary, Mike Lawrence, and said, Thompson just called me, so you can go ahead, and the press is going to want to get at me, so I'll be landed in 3 hours, and I'll be up at Vail or whatever. So I land, I called him, he said, well, there's about 6 TV crews coming to see you. And I said, all right. But I said, we're going to make a deal with them. They can interview me, but they can't show the mountains. Because I didn't want people to think, well, I'm in Colorado, on a junket. And, which I was. But anyway, all the TV crews come in, we do the interview. And, from then on, it was just full speed. We knew flying out that while life had changed for me as Secretary of State, it would begin to change now for Brenda and the kids, because this is the big time. There's only one thing bigger than this, and that's running for President of the United States.
But this is living in Illinois' fishbowl.
Oh yeah, this is this is going to be a big time. And we also knew, again, these early hours, these early days were important because we didn't want a primary opponent. George Ryan and I already had an understanding. He probably would run for Secretary of State. I'd run for governor. We'd support each other. He wouldn't run against me in a primary. But we didn't know who else might get in. And we didn't want a primary. We wanted to have a clean shot to the general election because we thought Neil Hartigan was going to have a clean shot, the Attorney General, who I was going to have to run against. But I'm running this meeting too at Vail.
You were president of the National Association of Secretary of State, so it was kind of a finale party. It turned out to be. Yeah. We didn't know it when we were headed that direction, but.
Mrs. Edgar, I would assume by this time you knew that he had a real passion for going after that job, but what was your reaction hearing the news that Thompson wasn't going to be running again and he was throwing it his direction?
Well, by that point in our life, I was ready for that challenge as much as one can be ready. You really have no idea what you're entering, but I knew that was Jim's hope to get the opportunity to run for governor, and I thought it was a good timing in the ages of the kids. So I was excited for Jim.
Our youngest daughter, Elizabeth, was going to be a senior in high school, and Brenda had never wanted me to be governor and have the kids live in the mansion. She just didn't think it was the best place for the kids to grow up. In fact, Jim Thompson always claimed, he told the Rockford editorial board, the reason he ran the last time for his 4th term was because Brenda Edgar said, we're not ready yet. Well, I told Brenda about 6 months before this all happened, I said, would you go tell Governor Thompson we're ready now? Because I said, and
Jim was ready.
But I think she knew it was going to happen. She was supportive, but I don't think any of us had an appreciation how much more this was a change than even being Secretary of State.
It's an enormous change, more than, as Jim said, that either one of us could have imagined.
But how so?
Well, you were constantly
the
in the media.
intensity.
Anything you said very well was going to appear on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, and it could be misinterpreted. Now, Secretary of State, I used to be able to babble about a lot of things I didn't pay any attention, but I learned very quickly as a candidate for governor, anything I said, anything I did would be interpreted, and sometimes wrongly, but it'd make a great news story. And also, people wanted you here, they wanted you there, you had to be there right away. There was all kinds of pressures that we particularly hadn't felt probably since the first race for Secretary of State. Then, while we're in Colorado, Don Rumsfeld, later Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, made some noise he might want to run for governor. That was out of left field, and so we were worried about that. And after about 2 days, he decided he really didn't want to worry about bridges in Saline County. That wasn't his thing. And so once he said he wasn't going to run, I felt pretty comfortable. Now, I did get a primary opponent, somebody from the far right, that was a nuisance, but I never worried about him beating me in the primary, but it was kind of a nuisance that we had to deal with. But the initially everything went very well. We quickly got the support of the party. We planned our announcement. We did a fly around in August, formally announcing. And we had huge crowds every place we went. We'd have 1,000 people.
So this is August of '89.
'89. And this is still almost a year and 4 months before the election. But it was full speed. at that point, and it was full speed all the way until election night. And again, I think, and the family was very much involved. Brenda particularly was out, several days a week campaigning. And again, it was different from the Secretary of State. But I also knew it was going to be a tough race. So again, I was uptight. I mean, I worried about any little mistake might cost us the election. Now, we made a lot of mistakes, but fortunately, so did the other side, and it all worked out.
Well, Mrs. Edgar, you talked before that he sometimes would come home and you'd be able to tell his emotions at the time. Was this a tougher time to be married then, dealing with the intensity of the election?
Well, it was extremely intense, and his mood was not the greatest, but he was gone a great deal of the time, so I didn't see him so much.
Well, let me tell you another thing, too, that we had not talked about. Brenda did not appreciate when we'd go out and do things. I'd kind of leave her. And, I'd go work a crowd or whatever, and she'd get left because so after I stopped being a state rep, she said, I don't want to do that anymore. Well, some state rep from Springfield had invited me to come to his fundraiser. Thompson was to be the speaker, and so I had Brenda. She says, I don't want to, she says, but you stay with me. I said, don't worry, we're just going as guests. We're not going to do anything. We walk in, Thompson had canceled, and the guy came in and says, you got to be the speaker, and you got to come into my VIP room. And he grabs me, and I'm off, and Brenda gets left. Well, I go into VIP, I get up and talk, then that's over, and I go look for Brenda. I can't find her anyplace. And I walk outside, the car's not there. Well, Brenda had taken the car and gone home because she said, you had promised. And I learned from that. So when I became Secretary of State and when I was governor, I made sure whenever we went to some function, somebody on the staff was assigned to take care of Brenda, make sure she didn't get left alone. Well, by the time I got to run for governor, she was kind of a star on her own. I mean, she would go places on her own. We didn't often go to places together. I mean, she was too important an asset to waste with me. She would go on her own. But I think I did a much better job when I was Secretary of State and governor to make sure she wasn't left on her own than I'd been a state rep. And she, she had her own people with her, and she had a traveling aide and somebody she felt comfortable with. But Brenda did a very good job out. Barbara Bush when she went around for President Bush, the first election, she showed a slideshow of the family. It's kind of a nice way to talk about the family.
The 88 election?
Yeah. A nice way to talk about the family and not have to make a speech. And so Brenda adopted that in the 90 campaign and went around and showed a slideshow on the Edgar family.
Well, Mrs. Edgar, you've already told us that you didn't like parades, especially after that one incident, and probably didn't like the flying part. Was there any part of campaigning that you did like? What would be the best part of it?
Well, you did meet a lot of very nice people, and it took a lot of very nice people to win the state of Illinois. It's a very diverse state, so it was a fun learning experience to meet people all over the state. And actually, after we left the governor's mansion, and we were so accustomed to seeing people all over the state, then suddenly we didn't see those people anymore because we weren't traveling to, every place in the state. So the people and their dedication and their willingness to help a candidate, it was very rewarding.
Were you expected to go out and give speeches?
I did that. Mm-hmm.
Did you enjoy that part of it?
I learned to.
I have enjoyed or tolerated.
Yeah, I have never liked the part when there is a camera and a microphone. Those are the two parts, almost right up there with disliking parades and flying, were microphones and cameras. Right. So those were things I wanted to avoid as much as I could.
I remember you got caught one time saying something that almost got you in some trouble.
Oh, that's probably more than once. I'm not sure which one.
Well, I think this had something to do with his health, perhaps.
Oh, when I thought it was off the record, probably. Is that right?
Well, I'm trying to remember the specifics about whether or not he would be running again, perhaps, or...
I think so. Do you remember that,
No,
Jim?
I was probably out then. I don't remember that.
I do.
Did you? Mm-hmm. Well,
I was just making an announcement someplace, and I someone asked me, a reporter, something about your health, and I don't know what I did say something, but
She was good.
by
though.
the time I got in the car, somebody was calling me to say, "Did you just say?" And I thought, "Oh, I guess I did just say."
She didn't make many mistakes.
But I
and
did
she was
make
very
some.
good. People
I made mistakes.
in the governor's race, I think she was a huge asset. And by the second time I ran, she was an old pro at it. I mean, I had my heart surgery, then she fell in a lot of times. But the first time, there's no doubt, she was like deer in front of the headlights when we started out. By the end of the campaign, she was very good at it, and was a huge help because people want to see the family. Brad was involved in that campaign. He had graduated from college, had some time off, and he went around, spent times on college campuses, and and again showed the family, and that's very important. And Elizabeth in the second campaign was involved. So the family really, I thought, was a huge asset in all my efforts, even though that they didn't necessarily like it. Elizabeth probably liked it the most. She's kind of like me. She likes politics. But the other two, they were good troopers.
You
They
know, you
stuck it
do what you need to do to make something good happen, and the good that happened was Jim became governor, and
Now,
he was
the
a good governor.
Now, the
and
night I won, I remember Brenda couldn't do this, but Brad came up and said, "Dad, congratulations, I'm out of here." And he left.
Well, you and I had a very extended conversation about that 1990 campaign. You described it as one of the classic gubernatorial campaigns, and I certainly would agree with you on that. So I would encourage people to check it out if they want
Right.
to find out a lot more about that.
Yeah, 90, I think everybody that's involved would say that was the classic because
Let's talk about the moment, though. Finding out, and this was late in the night, as you explained in some detail, the moment of finding out that you were finally victorious.
Well, the election was nip and tuck, back and forth, and then President Bush, I started to pull away about 3 weeks before the election, and then 2 weeks before the election, President Bush went back on Read My Lips and raised taxes, and things just plummeted for us. And I thought we were going to lose. Now, Brenda kept trying to tell me, no, we got a chance, but I thought we were beat. So the last 2 weeks, I was very depressed going through the campaign. And then on election day, we get to Chicago after we'd voted in Springfield, and I guess I'd voted in Charleston. I got home, voted in Charleston. Then we flew up from Springfield, and one of my press aides caught me on the tarmac at Meigs Airfield and said, "Exit polls have you up 6 points." I think, well, great. At least I'm not going to get wiped out, because I thought I was going to get wiped out. And then the final exit poll, which we knew would get tighter, had me up 1.5%, which I'd never heard of 0.5%. But anyway, I knew at least I was in the ball game. And early in the returns, mainly from Chicago, I was getting beat pretty bad, and we had this VIP reception, and everybody would come up to us and say, "No matter what happens, you ran a good race."
Where was this?
This was at the Hyatt in Chicago, where our election night was. And Brenda, all of a sudden, she was gone, and I go back in our room, she's crying. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "We're going to lose, aren't we?" And I said, "No." I said, for 2 weeks, I've been saying we're going to lose. I now think we're going to win, because I did a quick check around with precincts from around the state, and I could tell we were running well enough. I thought we were going to hold on. Well,
and there's somebody in the campaign who always knows the numbers, always knows all the local districts.
We had enough people placed around the state that we could get results from courthouses before AP did, and we knew how kind of weighed in our mind. And so, and I also knew in Chicago, while we're getting beat, we're not getting as beat as bad as Republicans usually do. So I remember about 12 o'clock, they still the networks hadn't given us the election, which meant Hartigan hasn't conceded. And everybody's still nervous as can be. Well, we were ahead by about 1 o'clock, and we were far enough ahead, there weren't enough votes out for us to lose. So I said, I knew a guy that had worked for us that was in the network headquarters out east, where they were making the calls on election. I said, get a hold of Bob Teeters and tell him to look at Illinois again, because we're going to win this race. There's not enough votes out to beat us, and if they don't hurry up and declare us the winner, it's going to be too late to have a party, and the next 4 years is going to be miserable. This is the only fun we're going to have. So about 20 minutes later, all the networks come on and say, there's been a change in Illinois. Edgar has pulled ahead and is going to be the next governor of Illinois. Neil Hartigan calls, very gracious, concedes, and then that's the moment. We're going downstairs, and we're upstairs at the top of the Hyatt. We're going down, and everybody's on the main floor at the Hyatt, the Regency downtown, and there's an escalator you take down the last floor. And we're at the top of that escalator, and I'm looking down this sea of people who for hours had been worried we were going to lose. And a lot of them had stuck their neck out. Some of them were Democrats who were for us in Chicago. And they were just beside themselves because we were won. And so we're up above, and we're going down, and you're seeing all these people being delirious because we had made it. And that, all I said, is the high point of my political career. I mean, that was the greatest feeling that I've ever experienced in politics, was that escalator ride down to the main floor at the Hyatt that night. And I don't know how about Brenda felt, but I was a pretty happy camper at that point.
Well, Mrs. Edgar, your view of that night.
Well, it was extraordinary, and it was exciting, and everybody was just beyond happy. But I think the first moment that it became a reality to me was after the inauguration. After Jim had been sworn in, we were going to get in the car to go to the mansion, and the license plate had won governor. And at that moment, I thought, he's governor.
Well,
So that was my moment of,
the other moment was a few weeks later. The governor's conference in the winter is always in Washington, D.C., and one of the things we do is go to the White House. And I remember we go over to the White House, and President Bush is the president, and he has his cabinet there. So I see all these people I've seen on TV and everything, and then I see some other big-name governors. And there's this big square table with names of all these important people. And I look down, and there's my name. And I thought, I'm at the table. I've made it. And I think those two moments are probably the two moments that, all that work, all that stress and everything, that was the payoff. And that was worth it felt like at that point.
But just a few minutes ago, Governor, you alluded that once you got to the job, it was going to be miserable. I think that's the phrase you used.
It was. The first,
It was.
the first 2 years, the state was broke. I had a Democratic legislature. They didn't want me in because it was redistricting year. They wanted a Democrat that signed their map. I'd barely won. I didn't have a mandate. Most people didn't know, is this kid from downstate going to be able to do this? And, Jim Thompson had been a very successful, very flamboyant, bigger-than-life kind of person. That wasn't Jim Edgar. And so I think a lot of people were just, well, is this a fluke? How's he, he's in. How's this going to work? And, Mike Madigan was going to teach me a lesson. I'd got word that he was going to show me who was boss, and we had to go at it. And it was, there were weeks and months when I was the only guy on my side. I mean, even Republican legislators had deserted me because some of the cuts I had to make and trying to get a tax reenacted. I mean, it was not a real easy first session.
Were there protests going on even in Springfield at the
I
time?
had every probably interest group that got money from the state at some time protesting outside my office because I was cutting budgets right and left. And
they would be beating drums,
they'd come to the mansion,
making chants, and Jim would be getting dressed, and he would be in a not so good mood, and he'd say, "You don't understand, Brenda, this is going to be the worst day of my life." But he said that many times during those first
well,
3
one
years.
time I'm giving the budget address, and it's a grim budget address, and some protesters get on the floor and rush me. And now, I wasn't too worried, but that just never happened before. Our dog, we had a dog, a white, half golden, half Samoyed, so she was white. We had demonstrations around the mansion, and she came in, she had lipstick all around her neck. Somebody grabbed her and put lipsticks around her. I mean, and there were just things like that you kind of put up with those first couple of years. But after the first session, when we kind of got the budget the way we wanted, and we got the tax extended, and the speaker and I kind of came to an understanding that he understood that I was probably going to stand firm on things, it got a lot better, but it still took a few years to get out of the financial mess we were in. Second term was much easier. Mm-hmm. I think Brenda, of course, I went through the open heart surgery, running for re-election in 94, and Brenda had to step in and do a lot of the campaigning at that point. And
well, it makes all the world of difference if you're in a recession, and a fairly deep recession in the early 90s versus the booming economy by the time you get to the mid to late 90s.
Well, we like to take credit. We did it, but we got helped by outside events. But I think we did the right things in the early 90s so we could take advantage of the good years toward the end of the 90s. Unfortunately, I think they forgot that after I left office. you've got to be fiscally disciplined. You can't, even when good times, you got to watch how you spend the money, and you got to plan for. And it's all cyclical. It never stays good forever, and we knew that. But the first 4 years, first 3 years particularly, I'd say right up to the Great Flood.
93.
93. The flood, in a lot of ways it turned, it's like going to war. Everybody unites around you. And the Great Flood, I could tell a shift in just public attitude, and I could tell a shift in the legislature. Everybody kind of looked to us to lead, and we did. I think the flood gave us an opportunity to demonstrate to people that we were on top of the game, and we took a very bad situation and made it as livable as possible. And but 93 on, things got much better. Re-election in 94. We had an early lead that pretty well hung in there, then got bigger as the campaign went along. So, I thought unless I really messed up, I would get reelected. I thought all along. So that, I think, made life a little easier around the mansion.
Well, let's talk about the mansion. I've got a couple questions for you, Mrs. Edgar. It sounds like, to a certain extent, you weren't necessarily looking forward to moving to the mansion. Did you find it was fun to live there?
Well, once again, it was very interesting. It's not like living in your own home, because everything there belongs to the people of Illinois, including, the things in your personal quarters and the private quarters. It's a beautiful and historic place to live, filled with priceless antiques, and
it's big.
It's big. And I felt a huge responsibility to maintain it well and to keep things in a manner that the public would appreciate when they came.
She did a very good job.
Was there another place that was kind of the hideaway that you can get away?
We did have a wonderful hideaway. We had a log home north of town, north of Sherman, and that was a great place to go because it was so comfortable and so casual.
We had our old furniture.
We had our old furniture. It felt like home. I think, if I wanted to find Jim, I could say Jim, and he could hear me in the mansion. If you wanted to find somebody, you just had to keep walking until you found him, because it was so big and soundproof that you couldn't just kind of yell out a name and they'd say yes.
Was Elizabeth there that first year when you were living in the mansion?
Her last semester.
Just a few months then.
Yeah,
just
a few months.
Had a prom party there. And she also.
And that summer, I think she was there. Then she went away to college in the fall.
As she said, she got to enjoy the luxury of the mansion, but didn't have to do it too long. Yeah. She didn't
because there were
she did have to
restrictions.
First time she had to have state troopers go with her when she'd go out to parties at night with her friends. She had state troopers.
Put dampers on the dates if you want to go on a date.
They didn't date. They just all went in groups, and she had a deal with the troopers. I never quite understood what all the deals were, but they would drop her off and they would pick her up.
At school.
Well, at parties too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Maybe just as well you didn't know all the
As
details.
probably
a lot
I
of
didn't know
things
all the
happen.
details because sometimes she took her little car and left.
Yeah. But she I think she enjoyed that part of it, but she was ready to get out after one semester.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Mrs. Edgar, tell me a little bit about your relationship with the media. Now, we've touched on it a little bit, but especially now that he's governor, he's taken some major heat rounds those first couple years.
Well, the best I could, I avoided the media. That was one of my quiet challenges, was to avoid the media, and I didn't really want to speak with them or to them because I didn't always think that they interpreted what I said correctly. Sometimes you could read a quote in the paper of something that you never said or even thought about, so I didn't appreciate that. And so I just tried to avoid the media.
But you did deal with the media. I mean, you had projects that you recognized you had to get publicity on.
But
and you did
on
fine
political
on
issues, I avoided
Well,
them.
she tried not to get involved in issues that was going on over at the State House, and she had certain issues, adoption, children things. She was very much involved in, and I can't remember you got very much. Your press was a lot better than mine.
Well, but I avoided the press.
But what was the most first ladies do want to have something that's kind of their signature project or something that they pursue. What was yours?
Mine was children's issues and women's health, and we did a great deal in both areas, and I felt.
Had project success.
But that was more yours than mine.
No, that was your. Oh no, what was the thing you did with kids? And you had the books made up
Help
and
Me Grow.
Help Me Grow. That's right. Help Me Grow. Yeah.
I do want to show another
And
picture.
the teddy bear.
Yeah, I
mean,
do want
that's-
to show
okay.
another picture, and this is a picture that's some poignancy to it. This is the one of Oklahoma City. And have you
right.
tell us about the teddy bears that these people were holding in the memorial service after the bombing in Oklahoma City? And they're the teddy bears. Tell us about what those teddy bears, your connection with that picture.
Yes, I had gone to Marshall Fields and asked if they would help me design, create, and make a teddy bear. I asked Marshall Fields if they would sell one teddy bear, if they would give one to the Department of Children and Family Services, so that children who leave their home, sometimes with nothing that belongs to them, whether it's abuse or neglect, they would be given a teddy bear. And it turned into a very successful program. We sold a lot of teddy bears through Marshall Fields. They were fabulous partners with us. And when Oklahoma City bombing happened, I called Kathy Keating, who was First Lady of Oklahoma, and asked her if I sent her some bears, maybe 30 or 40, 50, if she'd want to take them to the hospital on visits to families. And she said that would be great. And then she called me back and said, well, could we have more of those bears? We're having a memorial service for the victims on Sunday, and we'd like to have some more. And I said, well, sure, we'd be glad to send them. How many do you need? And she wanted like 300 plus. And this was either Friday or Saturday before it was. She said that the airlines would fly them free, but we had a hard time locating the people that had the keys to the door where the teddy bears lived. But we found the key and got the bears loaded on the plane, and they were sent to Oklahoma City. And for me, it was rewarding because that little bear, PJ was his name, was created to give comfort to people who were in pain. And when I saw him on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, I knew that he was doing the job he was created
We
to do.
just happened to be home that Sunday.
Saturday and Sunday.
Whatever
I
the
talked to-
memorial service was, and
that was
we
Sunday.
turned on TV, and we knew they were going to get. And all of a sudden, they show the crowd, and everybody, all the families clutching these bears. I mean,
These
it
are
was
adults that are clutching
yeah,
the bears.
it was and the thing about a teddy bear, supposedly, for a child, it gives them. They've proven that it gives them comfort. Well, we didn't think about adults, and throughout the whole ceremony, Billy Graham and President Clinton were speaking and all. And they keep showing these people holding the bears. And of course, then the next day, that was the big story. NBC, I know Tom Brokaw had something about where'd those bears come from, and talked about Brenda. And it was quite an event. I mean, you realize these bears served a purpose we never dreamed of in some ways. But she was all over the state promoting the bears, and it was a very successful program.
And fortunately, we had sold probably 30,000, which is pretty phenomenal. And so we had plenty of bears to share.
And making a difference in the process, it sounds
Right.
like.
There was one letter she got from a lady that worked in Children and Family Service who said she really thought when this first came up, this was kind of a phony, probably just a political thing, and really thought it was a lot about nothing. And she, but they gave the bears out, and she said she was just stunned at how the kids, even teenage kids, how much that bear meant to them. And she was writing to kind of, even though she'd never told us that, apologize for ever thinking that this was a sham, that this really was a great thing.
We had a tag on them that gave a phone number if you saw any child being abused and what constituted abuse. And so that was another way to tell the story about
Okay.
child abuse.
Just a couple other quick stories here about the time as governor, and this one deals with a more painful moment for both of you. In 1994 in July, and the governor has to go in for bypass surgery. Your feelings about that?
Well, I was stunned. Jim was kind of out of it at that point because they were, by the time I knew that they were going to do it, I was just stunned because had my suitcase packed. I was going to be traveling and ready to go on after he had this quick checkup at Good Samaritan, and I was shocked.
I was shocked too. I mean, I thought I was going in and just probably change medication. It was up at Downer Grove. A friend of mine's a cardiologist up there, and we went by to have him check, and he already thought there was probably a problem. He had a team of surgeons on standby, and so I go in about 8 o'clock at night. I had a full schedule that day, and finished up, went in there, and I wanted to go up there because I knew it wouldn't be in the paper. Sometimes things leak out down here pretty quick in Springfield, and so he said, "You're going to need open heart surgery," and he showed me the screen, and I said, "No, I can see the blockage." I said, "The only thing I care about is, can I make a phone call tomorrow at 12 o'clock? And he said, "Well, yeah, you should be able to." At why? And I said, "Well, I'm going to have the 4 legislative leaders in my office. We don't have a budget yet, and I'm going to leverage this for everything I can, and I want to get them to agree to a budget." So anyway, we go in, and they do the operation, and of course I don't know any of this stuff, and I come through at about 11 o'clock. They pull the tube out. 12 o'clock, I'm on the phone. But what I found out was that after the operation, they said everything was fine. They told Brenda everything's fine. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning or something. She goes back to the hotel and goes to bed. And our press office, we'd already alerted the press secretary to be ready. And they put out a notice there'd be a press conference, at 5 o'clock in the morning to announce we'd had successful surgery. About an hour later, they wake her up saying, "I'm bleeding, and if I don't stop bleeding, they're going to have to go back in and open me back up again." Well, you had that, plus the press was already alerted, so we could have a real problem. And she got a hold of her prayer group, and everybody prayed, and an hour later, bleeding stopped. And so I didn't know any of this. I wake up at 11 o'clock. I feel pretty good. I got this little button. If you got any pain, you just push this button, and you feel real good. And so I got on the phone at 12 o'clock and told all 4 of the leaders, and the lieutenant governor was there for me. And I said, "Guys, we're all out on a limb. Everybody thinks I'm near death," because this had been the big story that morning all over the state. We need to get a budget, and we need to all compromise. Well, about 2 hours, we had a budget. So I did get a budget.
I think we got a picture of you signing that budget.
And so they came out a couple days later to sign after that picture, they all left. I turned to my staff. I said, "I'm not doing this next year to get a budget." But we had a lot of events and things lined up, and there was also during the Baby Richards case, which is a very emotional thing, and rallies for that. And so Brenda went and did all that. Yeah, went and made talks, and she'd run back to the hospital and go out and do these events around the Chicago area.
And I know that Senator Netsch, when I interviewed her, Dawn Clark Netsch, your opponent that year, felt somewhat obligated to lay off of you for a little while.
She did. She was very good. She didn't. I always, in hindsight, I feel bad for her because we had run a media blitz and had moved ahead pretty good in the polls, and she was just getting ready to come back at me. Then I have this, and so she didn't do anything for about 3 weeks, and she did come back and hit me pretty good, but she waited for a while, and so we were in the hospital for a week, went to the mansion for a week, and then I got a week to go to Colorado. I already had a vacation planned and convinced the doctors to let me go, and we went out and hiked around in the mountains where poor Netsch couldn't run a blast because everybody thought I was still, invalid someplace.
So you absolutely swamp her in that election, an overwhelming victory for you, which has to be extremely gratifying. Much easier for the second term because you don't have the same kind of budget problems you had the first time around. But I did want to address the decision at the end of that time frame, maybe a couple years into the administration, the decision whether or not you want to run again. And Mrs. Edgar, the speculation is that, she didn't want to run again. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start with you. What was your opinion about his decision that he had about a year and a half out from that election campaign? It would have been in 1998. What were your views about him running for office again?
I had one view, and it was that he should do what he felt was the right thing to do. Whether he decided to run for governor again, whether he decided to run for the United States Senate, or whether he decided to leave politics, that he needed to do what was right for him, because he had spent all these years in the political world and worked hard at it. So if he wanted to continue in it, then that's what he should do. If he decided to go into the private sector, I would be happy, but it wasn't my decision to make. And I was very adamant telling him that's how I felt.
And she did. I mean,
But nobody believed that. And nobody does today.
Throughout the discussion, she never tried to tell me to do this or that. I knew that she would not be sad if I got out. I also knew that she kind of thought I was going to run for the Senate originally, but that it was my call. And it was a tough decision because it's hard to walk away when you've accumulated power. I mean, we see that with people. They stay and stay and stay, and because they don't want to give that power up. And even though I was tired, I thought 8 years is long enough, and it'd been a good ride, and it's time to go. It's still hard to actually let go, as I found when I had to make that speech. Didn't have to make that speech, but when I made that speech, and but it was my decision. I'll ask Brenda, but in the end, I'll do kind of what I want to do. Though I knew this decision would probably please her, but it's also what I thought was the right thing to do.
What was it that finally pushed you towards the decision to step out of the public arena?
Well, I'd thought about it for a long time, and
We discussed it for a long time. We would discuss it at lunchtime, and I would be pretty sure he was going to run for the Senate. And then we would discuss it at dinner time, and then I'd be pretty sure he was going to run for governor again. And then the next day we would discuss it at dinner, and I would be pretty sure he was going to get out. And he would convince me in these conversations that he was going to run for the Senate.
I knew I didn't have to make up my mind till I had the news conference.
Well, it sounds like you were the sounding board for that.
I was,
And
but I
didn't
was
tell the staff.
confused.
I didn't want, because I didn't want it leaked, and I wanted it to be when I said it, and we pretty well kept it that way, because I didn't decide until late that morning. We had a early lunch, and the two of us, and I said, I don't think I'm going to run.
And he had 3 speeches prepared. One said that he would run for the United States Senate. One said he would run for governor. And the third one said that he would
And nobody
leave.
really thought I'd get out. I mean, the speculation, all the state party people wanted me to run for governor again. The staff all wanted me to run for governor. Guy in the street, they more were looking at the U.S. Senate race, and they wanted me to run that. But in the polls, I could probably won either one of them. But I think I decided you need to know when to go, and you got to go when you want to go, not when they want you to go. And everything was, I was as good as going to get, so it was probably a good time to go. And I've never had any regrets about leaving then. I've had some second thoughts about the decision in 2006 when I didn't challenge Blagojevich for re-election. Not because I personally really wanted to be governor again, but just we needed a change, and unfortunately we didn't get a change. But that decision, I don't have any regrets on what I decided in 2008. One of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure we had time to see the grandkids, and we have been able in the last 14 years watch the grandkids grow up.
I think we got a picture maybe with the first grandchild that you're holding.
First one.
Would that be
Dakota.
born while you're in office yet?
Yes, he's 18 years old now. Yes.
He's a freshman in college. I just went out a couple of weeks ago and had lunch with him at Boulder. He's going to the University of Colorado. So they grow up fast. And we've had the luxury of being able to spend a lot of time with them as they grow up.
Well, and I think there's the picture of the grandkids.
That's a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, I guess.
And a couple other things that you both, I think, are passionate about. We got a picture of you and the dogs and the horses.
Yeah, I think you're talking about me being passionate about it, yeah.
Yeah, perhaps
The
so.
grandkids, Brenda's passionate, and I am, and the horses and the dogs is me. Yeah.
Well, I think, Ms. Edgar, you described this as that he was able to replace the passion for politics to a certain extent with the passion for the horses.
That's true, I think.
Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, but I was a little more successful with politics than I've been with horses. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to finish. Any final comments from either one of you?
The last comment I'd just like to make, we had a great opportunity. 10 years as Secretary of State, particularly 8 years as governor. It's a great state. People couldn't have been nicer. Still are very nice to us. And we just appreciate very much. As Brenda said, one of the things we miss is not seeing everybody. But that is the best part of politics. Politics has a lot of stresses and a lot of low points, but the high point are the people and a chance to get to know a lot of wonderful people, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, downstaters, Chicagoans. I mean, this is a great state, and we feel very fortunate we had an opportunity to be in the governor's mansion for 8 years and to serve in the chief executive office for those 8 years.
Any final
It was
words?
a privilege, it was an honor, and we are grateful to have had that opportunity.
And happy to be grandparents now.
You notice that smile on her face. That's a real smile.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. This has been delightful, and I just appreciate having the opportunity to do this.
Thank you.
And thank you for checking in on the lives of two of Illinois' more prominent politicians. Thank you.